Hi, I'm Carol Cropper, the current president of the RES, and I'd like to welcome you all to this year's virtual Royal Economic Society. Thank you for coming, and I'd like to also at this point extend my thanks to the organising committee of Ricardo Rice, Michael McMahon and Coralie Liam, and to Queen's University in Belfast, who are virtually hosting this. Thank you to everybody who's been involved. Can I first of all remind and thank you all for attending as well, even though we are virtual. Can I first of all remind you about the code of conduct? Please, can you take a moment to remind yourself of it? And it's important to the RES and to the profession that we behave respectfully towards our colleagues and to everyone who attends. The second thing I'd like to say is we have an absolutely brilliant conference content, and I'd encourage you to attend as many sessions as you can over the next 3 days. The platform that we're using is actually great for networking. And what you need to do for that, if you've not already acquainted yourself with it, is to use the attendees function to find others and to chat and connect with. I know that being remote can feel a bit like being remote, but I think the attendees function should allow you to kind of have the kind of quick, if not corridor chats or tea break chats, at least virtual chats with people that you wanted to talk to. I have one announcement about a session that's been added at quite late notice, which is we are partnering with the Government Economics Service to be running a short session. We'll be looking at the future of Claire Lombardelli from the GES will be talking to economists about how academic economists can help GES economists. So anyone that wants to be involved in that session will be coming up. And there's also a special session run by the Treasury as well, which is by the GES, which is the funding of future economic research on Tuesday at 3:30. So I think without further ado, thank you much, everybody, and I hope you will enjoy the conference. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our two past presidents' addresses this year, to be given by Lord Nicholas Stern. As many of you know, Nick has been in all our lives as an eminent economist for a long time. He's the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the LSE. He's chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and he's head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. He also has had a string of other very prestigious appointments, large contributions to public service to our profession. He was president of the British Academy between July 2013 and 2017. He was obviously president of the RES, and he's an elected fellow of the Royal Society in 2014, and he's held academic appointments at a number of universities, including Oxford, Warwick, and the LSE and MIT, and the École Politique and Collège de France in Paris, the Indian Statistical Institute in Bangalore and Delhi, and the People's University in China. And I think this reflects Nick's incredible global breadth, as well as being the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank. So he has a clearly global reach and global knowledge. He was also a public servant. He was the second permanent secretary at the Treasury between 2003 and 2005. And then he was head of the Stern Review on climate change in 2006. For all this, he's been knighted and then again made a crossbench life peer, and then finally appointed a Companion of Honor for services to economics, international relations and climate change in 2017. And he's obviously got a string of eminent publications. I think on that note, we're clearly incredibly pleased and honored that Nick, as past president, is going to finally given his address, given that he wasn't able to give it last year. And now we're going to go over to Nick. Nick's presentation is first of all recorded, and it's about 45 minutes, after which we will pick up again for Q&A. So please keep your questions rolling in. I will be answering them and putting them to Nick. So thank you very much. Over to you, Nick.
I'm Nick Stern. I'm past president of the Royal Economic Society. Very proud to have been president of this very special society. Of course, I'd hoped very much to be in Belfast all together with everybody a year ago. And then again, I hope to be in Belfast together with everybody this year, but it was not to be. So we go ahead in a virtual way. I'd like to say thank you to my successors, Rachel Griffiths, Carol Proper, Tim Besley, with whom actually I've been working very closely over the period of my past presidency, which has been an extended one, including around working with the government on COVID. It's been a pleasure to work with all of Rachel, Carol, and Tim. I also want to express special thoughts for my friend and predecessor, Peter Neary, with whom I've spent so many good times on economics and in other ways. And thank you to Leighton Chipperfield and all at the Royal Economic Society. Leighton, please pass on thanks to everybody involved. I know there are so many. Thank you to all from Queen's University in Belfast, and thank you to all those who worked so hard to make this virtual event into a reality. Now, my subject is a time for action on climate change and a time for change in economics. The second slide is giving the structure to what I want to say. I'm going to speak about the urgency, scale, and opportunity, about the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. We have to tackle these together. About investment, which will drive us out of the recession and onto a much better growth path, innovative investment, and the policies and finance that can draw that through. So I'll be speaking about action and the logic of action in the first three sections. But I want to save at least half of what I have to say about how economics must change. Because once I've set out what it is that we have to do on the basis of an understanding of the problem, that will point to quite a lot of things we have to do differently in economics. And that's what I want to argue. There's nothing more important or exciting than this problem. It opens up a tremendous amount of economics, but it is rather different. And it is something which I hope you will all get involved with. So let me start very quickly with the science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been in existence since 1988. And it has published a series every few years, a series of assessments of where we are. Each one of those has been more worrying than the last. The first one was extremely worrying, that was published in 1990, but it's just got more worrying as the evidence has got ever stronger of effects coming through more quickly than we thought and with a greater intensity than we thought. We're already about 1 degree centigrade of average global surface temperature, slightly above that actually, above the end of the 19th century, which is our usual benchmark. We're on the edges of the Holocene period, the benign period, where we grew up really and started, we turned grasses into grains and we sat down and waited for the harvest. So we had villages and we had surpluses, so we had universities and so on. So that was the period when we grew up, the last 10,000 years or so. We're already on the edge of that. We're already seeing very intense effects, whether they're fires associated with heat and drought, whether they're hurricanes and typhoons, storm surges, sea level rise, and so on. We're already seeing these extreme effects. But in the words of Ronnie Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. We are on target for, if you want to use that word, for well over 3 degrees centigrade if we carry on anything like the path that we're on at the moment. And we, in science, they've looked at those dangers, they've told us what can happen, and we really have to change. The 3-degree temperature to which we're probably headed, or more than that actually, if we carry on in the same way, we haven't seen as a world for around 3 million years. 3 million years. And that, when those temperatures were in place, then sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now. That kind of temperature radically changed lives and livelihoods across the globe. It's quite possible we could be at 4 or 5 degrees centigrade 100, 150 years from now. That would be absolutely devastating. So the stakes we're playing for are immense. So what do we have to do? Well, if we want to stabilize temperatures, we have to stabilize the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If we want to stabilize the concentrations, we have to have the flow at net zero. So that's what net zero means. It says that's what you need to do to stabilize concentrations, because you need to stabilize concentrations to stabilize temperature. The earlier you stabilize the concentrations, the earlier you go to net zero, the lower the temperature at which you stabilize. So that's the logic of the net zero target. If we want to stabilize at 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is wise, we have to go to net zero by mid-century. And slide 4 is the graph of the paths of emissions that we need to follow if we're to stabilize at different temperature levels. The next slide, slide 5, underlines the point that even 2 degrees is pretty dangerous, and that we should be going well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. I illustrate with some figures there, but let me just draw attention to one of those. If you look at the percentage of the global population exposed to severe heat at least once every 5 years, a 1.5 degree temperature, that would be 14%. A 2 degree temperature would be 37%. We'd way over double that risk of being exposed to extreme heat every 5 years. So it is absolutely wise to go for 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we look at all the risks, we think about it in a consequentialist way. Can we do it? We can do it, as I'll argue. Should we do it? Well, it makes a lot of sense to hold it down to 1.5 degrees. It's a target or guardrail approach to extreme risk, and then we know what paths we have to follow to get there. What paths are we in fact following? Well, that's my next slide. It will show you emissions going in the wrong way. They're going up, possibly they're starting to plateau. They seem to be starting to plateau, but if you look at the earlier graph of what we have to do, we really have to start turning emissions down now and drop sharply along the way. So we really have to change fundamentally the way we do things to get from well above 50 billion tons CO2 equivalent a year now down to net zero by mid-century. We have to do that everywhere, all the sectors, all the countries, because net zero is net zero. The sum total is net zero, so you better have net zeros across the board, because there won't be so many net negatives. Now, let me now look at the positive side of things. That story of rapid change across the whole system is a story of growth. It is full of innovation, investment, discovery, new ways of doing things. It's more efficient, it's cleaner, it's got cities where you can move and breathe, ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. It's a very attractive, different way of doing things with so many gains across the different dimensions of well-being. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. It does mean that it's sensible. It does mean that it's attractive. It does mean it's within our grasp. We've got to change radically, and particularly invest strongly to get there. So that is the challenge, but it is a real payoff in terms of a much better form of growth, and reminding ourselves that there is no long-run growth story that's high carbon. It just self-destructs. Can it be done? Well, this is my slide 8. That's a bit of a Barack Obama slide. It's a yes, we can story. And in particular, there are 4 forces at the moment which are particularly favorable. We've got low interest rates, we've got rapid technological change, we've got international understandings coming together, and we've got the young people of the world who are putting pressure on us, and quite rightly so, to change. So that's the first part of the story, why we have to change, the degree to which we have to change, but reminding ourselves that if we can do this, and we can do it, it's a very attractive form, new form of growth and development, and harmony with our environment, and getting down to net zero, looking after our biodiversity. Now, let me turn to the next part of what I want to say. Of course, we have to link this climate crisis, which I've described, to the COVID crisis. We are in a very special moment in history in two ways. The COVID crisis that we're experiencing right now, we hope that's a shorter term story, but we're not through it yet. And the climate crisis, which is going to stay with us for some considerable time, but is bigger and deeper and longer lasting even than the COVID crisis. And we have to get out of them both in a similar way. Strong investment, innovative investment. So let me just point to the decade before COVID, because that's important in understanding where we are. The decade before COVID, we saw around the world discussions of secular stagnation, falling investment rates, slowing growth, challenges of social cohesion and populism, and some faltering, particularly under President Trump, of internationalism, the internationalism spirit. And we saw, of course, as well as rising emissions, we saw damage to our, severe damage continuing to our biodiversity. So that was a picture, obviously snapshot, of the decade prior to COVID. If we think about the decade prior to COVID in terms of climate change, this is my slide 11, actually we were starting to get together. The Paris Climate Agreement was very important, 2015, which was also the year of the Sustainable Development Goals. Following that, we saw, and this was work I did with the New Climate Economy and work done at the OECD, we began to see that this new story of doing things differently was actually a very attractive, inclusive growth story if we got it right. In the last 2, 3, 4 years, private firm after private firm has declared itself for net zero. We have a network on greening the financial system, which is the central banks getting together. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in the budget of this year, 2021, enhanced the remit of the Monetary Policy Committee to include climate change. We have a coalition of finance ministers on climate action, which is moving, and investments in renewable power, for example, were moving very strongly indeed, and we've seen very powerful technical change. So some really positive movements in the last few years, certainly the last 5 years, running up to the COVID crisis. But we know, and this is slide 12, I don't have to remind you of the details. We are now with COVID in a deep, deep crisis, of course, of health, also of employment, but increasingly of finance and debt in many countries. The costs in terms of human life are tragic. The risks of an extended depression are real, and we are, for the developing world, facing a danger of a lost decade for development. So we have a climate crisis and a COVID crisis. So let's turn to what we do, and this is my slide 13. We have to tackle these crises together. Essentially, investment and innovation to drive us out of recession associated with COVID, and investment and innovation to drive us on to a new and very different pattern of growth and development. A big theme in all this, and I'll come back to it more than once in what I have to say, is the internationalism. We really have to tackle this and move together. That's my next slide, slide 14. And actually, internationalism now, there's always been an argument for internationalism, but now the argument is extraordinarily powerful. And let me express it in terms of quadruple wins or 4 wins. The first is that we're in a real recession, big unemployment. We have to expand demand to get out of that recession over the next year or two. And we know that expanding demand in countries simultaneously has a much more powerful effect than you expand demand in just one country, because if you expand demand in one country, that spills over to output and employment in other countries. So there's a big Keynesian argument to acting strongly, investing strongly for the recovery. Secondly, we have to reset expectations, not only for growth, but also for a different kind of growth. And if we reset those expectations together, then investors will know that the kinds of investments that they have to make are investments which are going to be of a kind that will be in harmony with around the world. The markets for those investments will be strong. Indeed, it will be difficult for you if you don't make investments in those new ways. Thirdly, Win, is that if we move strongly towards the new technologies, then we have increasing returns to scale. We've already seen that very powerfully in the way in which solar electricity has crashed in value, in cost. That's the same has happened in wind, the same is happening now with batteries. Electric vehicles costs are going to fall very quickly. That is a big return to acting together in getting that overall scale. And of course, what we're talking about with climate and diversity is global public goods. And if we emit less in one country, then all other countries gain from that drop in emissions. That's a quadruple win. So working together is of fundamental importance now, never been more important now, I think, than any time in history. There's lots we'll have to do to get there. Debt is going to be a big problem for many countries trying to reorient their investors. The private sector is going to be at the heart of all this. Actually, they are getting together quite well through the World Economic Forum and International Chamber of Commerce in other ways, reorienting around these very big issues of COVID and climate and tackling those together. So the final slide of this section, slide 15, is drawing attention to the urgency. Really, my slide showing how emissions had to fall demonstrated urgency very clearly. But let me emphasize it again with in slide 15. In the next 15 or 20 years, infrastructure will roughly double. If it looks anything like this new infrastructure, the same size as the old, if it looks anything like the old, you can say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. That's why we have to decide and act so quickly. You know, the world economy will probably double in 20, 25 years. If that new world economy looks anything like the old, similarly, you could say goodbye to 3 degrees. This will be a period, the coming 3, 4 decades, of very rapid urbanization. If those towns, new towns we build, if those expansions of the towns and cities that we have look very much like the ones we have at the moment, again, say goodbye to 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. So that sense, that urgency is absolutely critical in our decision making. The infrastructure we build in the next 15, 20 years will be decided in the next few years. So we really have to get our head round and our decisions around this issue very quickly. So that's the first half of what I wanted to say. But let me remark quickly about finance, because I've emphasized the centrality of investment, and that's my slide 17. So how much investment? What kind of orders of magnitude of investment do we need to make? Well, I would argue, and I haven't got time to give details of the numbers here, but I would argue that we probably have to increase investment by 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP to bring through the new ways of doing things, the new technologies I've described. A lot of them have capital up front. If you have renewable electricity, you have to invest up front and you save on the fuel costs down the road. So some of these investments are really about pulling capital forward. And of course, they're about making change. They're about replacing things perhaps a little earlier than we thought in a number of cases. So if you run the numbers, 2 or 3 percentage points, more in some places than others, but 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP is the kind of extra investment we have to make. That's not the same thing as a cost, because these investments have really tremendous returns in greater efficiency, cleaner air, better health, and so on. These are very attractive investments, but they have to be made. So we have to increase our investment by 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. That actually would take the investment rate back to where it might have been, say, 20 or so years ago. So well within the reach of possibility. And also, if you remember that I emphasized the secular stagnation, that was associated, and the very low interest rates, that's associated with planned investment being too small in relation to planned saving. And the answer to that is increased planned investment. So you realize, as it were, or you overcome secular stagnation by investing in new and very exciting ways of doing things. So investment is central, and I've tried to insist on raising the rate of investment in the economy and changing the composition of investment. To make that happen, we have to pull through using good policy and institutions. Now, I'll speak a bit more about the detail of policy in the last part of what I have to say. But what I want to emphasize at this point is that the signals have to be clear and strong in order to drive policy, because this is about investment over the medium and long term. So you need clear, strong, credible signals. We're also going to have a whole range of instruments. Carbon pricing is going to be important, but no way, and I'll explain this more down the track, but no way can you do all this just by carbon pricing. No, it's a critical part of the story, no doubt about that, but it certainly would not be enough. You're going to have to look at city design, you're going to have to look at regulation and standards, you're going to have to look at investments in R&D and so on, so many dimensions. And in order to have these clear, credible signals, we've got to be predictably flexible. It's a concept I've been pushing for some time now, predictable flexibility. And that means, or being predictably flexible, and that means that you have to, when you revise policy, do it in a way which people understand and which they will have been able to anticipate. So you say to them that the more that this new thing that we're subsidizing moves out into the productive world, the less we're going to subsidize. The more the costs come down, the less we're going to subsidize. So you're predictably flexible in that sense. Predictable flexibility has been a principle for monetary policy for a while now, but it should be something that occurs right across the board. And then the last part of the story will be finance. Clearly, I've pointed to a strong increase in investment. That will, and innovation, that will involve a certain amount of risk. We need to be able to get the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. I've emphasized the world's got plenty of savings, it's got a shortage of investment, that's the problem. But saying there's plenty of savings is not the same thing as saying it's easy to get the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. A lot of it will come from the private sector, a lot of it come from development finance institutions. So these are set out in slides 19 and 20, where I remind of the forms of finance. And in slide 20, I emphasized that we're going to need private sector finance, but international public finance, and with the international financial institutions at center stage. This is going to be a moment now with the crisis of COVID, with the importance of pushing up investment, with the importance of rapid change, with the importance of internationalism, that we're going to need to expand, strengthen our international financial institutions. So that finishes my story of what we need to do. Let me spend the last part of my time as saying, well, given this is what the world demands of us in terms of changing ways of doing things, investment, innovation, finance, the sets of policies that are necessary, how can we bring our economics to bear in a way that informs that very real problem, that urgent problem, the problem that demands our attention, and we can see how we should be responding to it. How can we bring our economic analysis to illuminate, to tell us as much as it possibly can about how to do this and why to do this and the methods that we should use, the policy instruments we should use. So that's the last part of my talk, but it's the one where we look particularly intensively at economics itself and why I'm arguing that it's time for change in economics. Well, let's look at the starting point, and this is my slide 22. I think we all appreciate, indeed admire, we should admire, the economics of Marshall and Pigou, where Marshall drew the attention to the difference potentially between marginal private cost and marginal social cost, and Pigou emphasized the idea of correcting for that, correcting for the externality, the Pigovian tax, which is the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost. Those are very important insights, and of course Pigou around 100 years or so ago, and Marshall before that. Around the time of the Second World War, 70 or so years ago, Ronald Coase started to look at these things in a different and very thoughtful way when he spoke of allocating property rights and establishing markets so that there could be some kind of trade in these externality producing goods. And James Mead, of course, wrote very insightfully about all this as well. Coming forward a bit further, just 30 or so or 40 years ago, David Pearce, for example, not alone, but David was quite strong on this, was writing about a blueprint for a green economy, essentially operationalizing the Pigovian idea. And all that was very valuable, very important part of our intellectual history in economics. But then, of course, climate change came along as an explicit problem. And I think the modeling of it begins with Bill Nordhaus's important and admirable paper, To Slow or Not to Slow, published in the Economic Journal in 1991, the journal of our Royal Economic Society. And so this new problem had arrived. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put together in 1988, climate change started to become a more active subject of discussion. And people saw, well, climate change could be disruptive. So the idea was then that by producing in a way that emitted greenhouse gases, we would be causing small perturbations, because people didn't think it would be that big, but we would be causing perturbations down the track. So Bill's question was, well, let's put it all into a growth model. Let's recognize these perturbations and ask ourselves, should we grow a little less faster than we might have imagined? And that was good economics. He took a problem that was emerging, put it in, tried to use the tools of economics of marginal social cost, marginal private cost, taxing for the externality, talked about small perturbations. We do marginal things in economics, and he put it into a standard growth model. So that was a sensible way to proceed. The problem was that over the next 10, 15 years following that, it became more and more clear that we were not dealing with a marginal problem. We were dealing with a problem of huge potential changes, which required very radical changes in our production systems and ways of consuming, as well as producing, that simply couldn't be picked up in marginal adjustments to growth rates or marginal damages of just a little bit of GDP. And that really was the problem. And Bill started a kind of industry of integrated assessment models, and it just went on too long. And we ended up with functions and parameters which had damages from climate change as far too low. I mean, really at 5 degrees centigrade damages, which were losses in current GDP of maybe 10, 15%. Well, you wouldn't worry about climate change if that was true, because you wouldn't get to 5 degrees even with bad luck for 100 years or so, by which point, if you've had a decent amount of growth, you wouldn't bother very much about losing 5 or 10 percentage points of GDP. But 5 degrees centigrade would be deeply dangerous, indeed existential, for hundreds of millions of people. Indeed, we probably would have seen huge conflict around the world way before we got to 5 degrees centigrade. It would be a world that could support a far lower population. You'd be seeing deaths on huge scale, you know, 100 millions of migrations of billions of people and conflict and so on. It just, you know, 5 or 10 or 15% of GDP doesn't begin to capture the kind of disruption that you'd see there. The second way in which the functions and parameters in these models went wrong was that they had diminishing returns to scale, increasing marginal costs of action. And that is something which, again, is very problematic in this context because we've seen increasing returns. So what happened was you started with a sensible attempt to write down a problem in using the kinds of tools that we had, but it ended up you were shoehorning a very big problem into quite a modest framework, and it just didn't fit, and it was very misleading. So my next 2 slides just underline the idea, this is slide 24, the idea that the stakes we're playing for are absolutely immense, and suggesting that the right way to respond to that is to think about the huge risks, think about what we can do, and then put in targets or guardrails, rather than pretend that you can actually manage to express that in a coherent optimizing model. This is about the management of immense risks, and I think the sensible consequentialist approach to that is to think of guardrails and think of how you keep within them. Slide 25 underlines the issue of increasing returns to scale and very rapid change in technology. It's been absolutely remarkable, and that's illustrated in slide 25. You know, who would have thought when we published the Stern Review 15 years or so ago that the cost of solar panels would be coming down, you know, by a factor of 10 or that kind of number? It's absolutely remarkable. Of course, so these models have suffered from the problems of underestimating costs and damages from climate change and overestimating costs and ignoring increasing returns to scale. The last thing I want to emphasize, and it's not just an issue for these kinds of models, it's a broader question of approaches to these kind of big intertemporal problems, and that's about discounting. And the discussion of discounting around climate change has been, in my view, very weak. And in order to put it on good foundations, and this is my slide 26, you have to start with the right concept. And the right concept is the social discount factor. What's the value of a unit of output or consumption down the track relative to one now? That's the relative shadow price. That's the kind of concept that we should be using in economics. And then the social discount rate is the proportional rate of fall of the social discount factor, but it's the social discount factor, that relative shadow price, that is the right thing to look at. Of course, it can depend on which good you look at, depend on which individual you look at, or even which state of nature. So that relative valuation will depend on 2 things under most, or many at least, systems of value judgments, and these are value judgments. It will depend on how well off you think we will be in the future, if you're thinking about the relative value of a unit now in the future, and it will depend on how much you value future generations relative to this generation, irrespective of what they might consume or produce. Now, I think, and this isn't the place to argue in detail, but pure time discounting is just discrimination by date of birth. And that's to say, even if the next generation has exactly the same as we do, I'm still going to give it a lower value. The only reason for doing that would be the probability that it might not exist, and that is something that you can build in. But the most important part I want to emphasize here is that how much you value a unit of consumption or income down the track relative to now depends on how well off you think you will be then. And that's entirely endogenous in this context, particularly in this context, because if we act recklessly on climate change, the future generations will be much poorer than those. And that is an argument that's developed in slide 27. But I also remark that it's pointless to look for these ethical values in capital markets, because capital markets don't reflect ethical values. They're thoroughly distorted in many ways, and they embody risk and attitudes to risk in ways which are hard to pick up. So these are now, and this is the last part of what I have to say, ways in which, based on what I've said about what is not a particularly good way of doing things, the IAMs, so how should we look at all this? Well, I think we're going to need a whole suite of models, a suite of perspectives, a collection of different ways of understanding parts of this, and then good judgment in putting it all together. So slide 28, I set out what kinds of things should we be capturing? Well, we've got to think in a deeper way about extreme risk that could kill very big parts of our population, that could wreck the lives and livelihoods of people living in some places, and if they don't die, they'll have to move. Those immense risks are what we're talking about here. So we have to develop ways of thinking about them. We have to recognize, and I'll develop this, the many market failures that exist, which are highly relevant to our problem, that many markets are absent. We have to think about very rapid technological and systemic change, not something we're used to doing in economics, but we better get used to doing it, because that's exactly what we have to do. And something that's been with us a lot, of course, is the distributive impacts, but they're particularly intense in this context, because it's the poor people who get hit earliest and hardest from climate change. So I've emphasized that these four things are outside the standard IAM modeling, integrated assessment modeling, but are at the core of our issues. So we better be looking very carefully at them. Let me speak very quickly about market imperfections. That's my slide 29. I've got 6 market imperfections here. Number one, and it should be number one, is the greenhouse gas externality itself. And we can tackle that in a good Pigovian way with the carbon tax or cap and trade scheme, but also important, we can do it through regulation as well. R&D, the next one. That's, of course, a very familiar source of market failure, but it's of intense importance in this context where we need to find ways of doing things so quickly. A lot of this is about investment. So a lot of it will be about risk and in capital markets, and we know that capital markets don't handle risk so well. What can we do? Well, we can think about guarantees, we can think about development banks, different kinds of long-term contracts and so on. Big policy agenda there. So much of this fourth area where markets fail is about networks. This is about grids, it's about public transport, it's about recycling and reusing, it's about broadband. You know, so much of this is around networks, and we know that networks which involve coordination cannot function without government action. That doesn't mean that they're public sector, but they cannot function well without government action. Huge amounts of information issues. We want to know what we're consuming. We want to know about new technologies, huge information issues. And finally, but not least, is the so-called co-benefits. Air pollution kills something approaching 10 million people a year in the world. It's hard to be precise, but that ballpark, some internal, some external. That's in a number of people who die each year of 50-some million. So 10 million from air pollution associated with air pollution is a huge story. That is very big. And of course, the biodiversity part of this is enormously important. Biodiversity and climate are not the same things, but they're very closely interrelated. And the damage we do from fossil to our biodiversity from fossil fuels is immense. So there's not just one externality, not just one market failure here. These are 6. They're also important, and this is slide 30, there are also very important absent markets. We can't trade on carbon prices across a very long distant future when so many of our investments are about that. We can't trade for the new technologies because we don't know whether they will exist or not. These absent markets, and of course we don't know about future policy, these absent markets are extremely important, and we know that a competitive equilibrium with absent markets is not necessarily Pareto efficient. This is a big issue. So we have to act on expectations. That's something I've emphasized earlier, but it is a very important part of the story. And it's not just the absent markets, there are also problems with government abilities and government failures and the political economy. Governments can't fully commit. They may have short time horizons. They may have different, narrower objectives. So in thinking about public policy, we've got to put all those things together. And building strong institutions which can survive across different parties in power, which is we've tried to do in the UK with the climate change legislation, the climate targets, and so on, the climate budgets. That is something where institutions can play a valuable role. But you can see the richness of the policy question, as I've put it, goes way beyond simple carbon pricing, even though carbon pricing has to be a big part of this story. I mean, just think about setting targets for electric vehicles, or if you, the other way around, British government said you can't sell internal combustion engines after 2030. That gives a very clear and strong signal. And indeed, the car firm said, right, we know where we are now. That gives us the confidence to really go after this in terms of R&D, product development, and increasing returns to scale. So that's an example where increasing returns to scale, strong risk, and worries about what government might do lead you in the direction of policies which have a particular shape. Let me turn to slide 31. What kind of research agenda does this raise for us? Well, I've just listed 6 enormously rich areas potentially in slide 31. A lot of this is about changing behavior. A lot of this is about changing values. My friends Tim Besley, Torsten Persson, done very interesting work on changing values. A huge literature now on changing behavior in economics, which is, I think, one of the best parts of economics in the last 20 or 30 years. We're going to, thirdly, have to understand innovation in a much deeper and stronger way, because it's absolutely the heart of the story. And this will be innovation beyond simply just one particular technology. It'll be innovation in one particular industry. It'll be innovation in our whole ways of doing things. Efficiency is something we have to scrutinize much more powerfully than we've done in the past. There's a funny kind of notion or perspective on efficiency in economics, which says that, well, I'll caricature it in the Chicago theorem, which says that all that exists is efficient, because were it not efficient, it would not exist. Well, we've got to think of it more deeply than that. There are all kinds of inefficiencies in our system that exist, and we have to try to understand them and overcome them, because resource efficiency, circular economy issues will be fundamental. So much of this is about changing systems, energy, cities, transport, land use, big systems that you can't change by fiddling just with one parameter. You don't redesign a city just with a carbon price, even though you jolly well should have a carbon price and congestion pricing to help look after your cities. And finally, biodiversity. My good friend Partha Dasgupta published a very important review earlier this year, earlier in 2021, which provides a very valuable way of looking at those things. And we're going to have to tackle climate and biodiversity together. They're not the same thing, and there will be measures which don't overlap, but there'll be a lot of measures which do overlap, and that's something which should form a very big part of our policy story. This is a story now which we know is a fundamental economic change, and fast. Time matters. The paper I wrote for my good friend Tony Atkinson in the Journal of Public Economics 2018 issue in honor of Tony was called Public Economics as if Time Matters. You bet time matters on this one, and we better have an economics that looks at fundamental change in real time where time matters. How structures change is absolutely of fundamental importance here. So we need a big focus on the economics of change, which should be fascinating. That will involve, as I've stressed, looking at innovation, looking at behavior, looking at political economy, looking at the dynamics of all those things. And we'll need all of economics here. If you just think of the economics of international, industrial, labor, health, education, environment, energy, all those forms of economics and more, and economic history is so important. all this. All of this comes in a very powerful way. So we shouldn't be narrow if we're going to take on big problems of this kind. We should be economists. We might have our specialities, but we've got to recognize that all of economics comes into this. There's never been anything more important. There's never been anything more fascinating. And that is why I think it's time for change in economics. I hope you will all, young and old, embark, as I've done, with enthusiasm, but particularly the young amongst you. This is your subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, for an absolutely fascinating and so wide-ranging yet joined-up talk. I can see the questions flooding in. I have loads myself, but don't want to take up time from the audience who sat through such a fantastic talk. But thank you again. We now have 25 minutes before the hard stop at 12:15 for a number of questions. And there are quite a lot that have popped in that are very popular. So Nick, let me read you the first one, which is a large number of people are asking, could you elaborate on the role of financial markets in pricing in climate risk and promoting action? You were hinting at that a number of times, but I think it would be great to hear more your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Finance is indeed at centre stage. It's at centre stage in terms of secular stagnation and mobilizing savings in the right direction. That involves good public policy, but it also involves financial markets themselves understanding the issues. So there's that big macro sense in bringing, as it were, this great volume potentially of planned savings to match up with the planned investment that we think we know we should expand. The second is the management of instability in markets. And there, what we're doing actually is repricing fairly quickly a lot of the things which were focused on fossil fuels in different ways, so that they now have much lower prices and other things have much higher prices. Public policy should be pushing in that direction, and the expectation should be pushing in that direction. If that's not managed in a transparent and clear way, there's a risk of financial instability. And Mark Carney has quite rightly pointed very strongly to the importance there. And finally, and it's related to both these things, but it's not exactly the same, is the way in which finance can actually manage risk. And let me talk briefly about sustainable infrastructure. A lot of infrastructure investment is long-term and has early stage risk. So you need to manage the long-term flow of finance, and you need to manage the early stage risk. Managing early stage risk can be in form of guarantees. It could be in the form of equity, which is held by a development bank. And we've just set up the National Infrastructure Bank in the UK. Some of us, Tim Besley and I, are pushing very hard on that for some time, which is to help manage early stage risk, but through equity guarantees and so on, but also to help with making more secure the long-term flows. And if it works well, that allows, if you're through the early stage risk, if you've got long-term flows of revenue which have been established, at that point, you can have takeout finance, which allows, as it were, the pension funds to now put their money into an asset which is more secure and has long-term flows. So those are three ways: macro, planned savings, planned investment, instability, and then the management of the risk in the markets to enable the investments. Much more to say, but you can see that finance is everywhere in this.
Thanks, Nick. And I think there's a kind of related question, a related very big picture question, which is, how is international coordination guaranteed to achieve climate change targets? The problems of free riding are obviously everywhere. And what mechanisms do you think are necessary globally? And in some ways, you were quite positive about this. I think a lot of economists might be quite gloomy about this when we look at the vaccine rollout coordination. Anyway, that's the question: international coordination and to try and get climate change targets.
I've been working internationally all my professional life, and 10 years of my life as chief economist of first EBRD and the World Bank. And I've learned that there's nothing guaranteeable in international coordination, but you can improve the odds. You can do better. And I think the first thing is to understand the problem in its great severity. And there, I think people have taken that in terms of responsibility, that because this is so big and we all play a role, that we do have a responsibility. And economics can often dismiss that kind of approach too quickly, that many people do things because they're the right thing to do. I worked very closely with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, for many years, who really transformed his country to a real sustainable growth story. And I remember this would have been in 2010 in Durban, I think, no, 2011 in Durban at the COP there, where he said on an Africa panel, which I had the privilege to sit on with him, that it's not justice to foul the planet because others have fouled it in the past. Those were his words, Prime Minister of Ethiopia. So that sense of responsibility is, I think, an important part of the story. Secondly is the self-interest one. So much of what we have to do now is valuable, even if we've never heard of climate change. I mean, like cities where you can move and breathe and be productive. Not everything. There'll be some things which will have higher cost. Flying, I mean, we'll get there with zero carbon fuels. We will, but they'll probably be more expensive for quite a long period of time. Some things will be more expensive, but so much of what we have to do will be actually a net gain, which arises, for example, from cheaper electricity because we do it in much better ways. Electric vehicles are much more sensible, much more efficient, lose much less energy than internal combustion engines, and those will come down in cost as well. And of course, we'll drive those with zero carbon electricity. So much of what we do is actually going to be in our self-interest, even if we've never heard of climate change. Not all of it, don't get me wrong, but much of it. And thirdly, I think we actually see remarkably now, in a very strong way, the returns to acting together. So I think those three things, the right thing to do, the self-interest, and the remarkable intensity of the payoffs to the international collaboration now, are three factors which can help us. But there aren't any guarantees. It needs leadership, it needs pressure. That's why it's such a privilege to be at universities, where we all get older, but more or less they stay the same age, the students. And they're quite rightly giving us a hard time on this, and they should. And they do it in an intelligent, well-informed, forward-looking way. So I do think that the three arguments I've given, plus the pressure, which is coming in very good ways. You can all watch Greta Thunberg tonight, I think, on BBC One. But it's not just Greta, it's our own students. Across the world are pressing. And they understand this. They've been taught it in schools for the last, the ones that come now at age 18, 19 have been taught it for 8 or 10 years at school. They get it. So I think that pressure of the young also makes me optimistic. But it's one thing to be optimistic about what we can do. It's another to be optimistic about what we will do. And it's obviously that we can do it is logically prior to arguing that we should. But I think it's part of our job, if we look closely at the problems, using the techniques we've got. Economics is enormously powerful here if we use it well, to help change what we can do into what we will do.
Thanks, Nick. That segues really nicely into another question that's been really popular, which is both thank you for the lecture and then talking about the column that you and Andrew Oswald wrote in 2019 in a Vox EU column entitled Why Are Economists Letting the World Down on Climate Change, in which you made an observation that the QJE had not at that point published an article on climate change. And I think the question talks to, are economists really taking this seriously?
Not seriously enough. Are they taking it seriously? I think that really is beginning, but nowhere near seriously enough. And interestingly, Andrew Oswald and I got an email last night from a couple of young students, Sam Butler-Sloss and Mark Beckman, who had done some further work following up on that article which you just quoted, and it's still extremely low. Of course it's rising, but it is quite remarkable how a problem of such intense importance and absolute fascination, where all parts of economics can kick in and help us on this, how slow it has been. And I worry a bit about that. And I think our focus in the profession on just a few journals, on just a few methods, even if the journals are good and even if the methods are good, is somehow intensely conservative. There is a way of doing well. There's a way of proving your excellence. And it tends to be a bit conservative. And the example that many of us have used in the past is the great difficulty that George Akerlof had in publishing Is There a Market for Lemons, which was absolutely pioneering, but obviously it turned things over in important ways. Now, good old George did eventually publish it in the QJE, but there's a conservatism in our profession which I find a bit worrying. And on climate change, it's so worrying because the problem is so big and economics has so much to contribute. I hope that is changing as the younger people start to come through and our graduate students want to work on this. It's wonderful. I mean, I just speak about the LSE. I'm sure other people are finding it as well. More graduate students want to work on it. So I hope that will change, but we're in such a hurry. We can't wait just for that generation to come through. We've got to do it ourselves, all of us, whatever age.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I might come back and say, are all academic disciplines somewhat conservative? And that's something we have to fight against. And not very good, I think, in economics at joined up things. I think COVID has shown that health was a separate silo, and you've emphasized how many areas the environmental change impacts upon. I think that relates to a question that's come in, which is, what is the political economy of this? And the questioners have asked, many countries even failed to implement a similar agenda with respect to COVID, which, as you indicated, is a smaller problem than this. So what are your views on that?
Political economy has been very important. And those of you who don't know her work, there's a wonderful historian of science called Naomi Oreskes at Harvard University, who's documented the way in which, particularly the fossil fuel industry, for such a long period of time, tried to undermine the story. And there's a famous quote, "Doubt is our product." So what they tried to do is to sow doubt. And Naomi's book with Conway called Merchants of Doubt. And vested interests can be very powerful, and they have been very powerful here, as they were with smoking. And actually some of the same individuals were involved in trying to rubbish the evidence on smoking, and they tried to rubbish the evidence on climate change. But I think the evidence is built, the scientists were steadfast and stayed strong. And now actually that political economy is starting to change. I think firms are committing to net zero, partly because they think it's the right thing to do. And we shouldn't dismiss that, but also under pressure from customers, from shareholders, from workers. Unilever, for example, where Paul Polman transformed Unilever in the 10 years that he was chief executive. Alan Jope has taken that on. They get something like 2 million job applications a year. They're getting the best people. And if you get the best people, you do better. So I think the political economy has changed. I'm not, I don't want to wax too optimistic, but the payoff to opposing in the corporate sector has started, that calculus of the returns to opposing has really started to change. That you not only are bad, you look bad. And if you look bad, then that detracts from the workers, that discourages customers, discourages shareholders. So I do think that that political economy is changing. But don't get me wrong, it's hard, it's tough. I've worked all my life in developing countries and very heavy vested interest in coal. And coal, of course, is the worst of all the fossil fuels, but very big vested interests in coal. A lot of interests, vested interests in cutting down forests. I mean, those vested interests are still strong. It's our job to change the logic of the argument and to change the political economy. We are moving in a good direction, but my goodness, it's very far from that political economy story.
Thanks, Nick. I think this relates to a question that's been very popular, which is, what new data is needed to support this agenda?
Yes, I think data on the management of systems will be extremely important. The management of electricity systems, the management of transport systems, the management of land, the management of cities. I think that's going to be hugely data intensive and very actually artificial intelligence intensive as well, because those 4 big systems are a huge part of what we have to change. And I think how we do that is enormously important. A second way in which data will be important, is understanding what we buy. If you can understand very quickly the carbon and indeed biodiversity implications of what you're buying, I think that can change behavior. I think information about the labor market will be very important, because we're changing activities very rapidly here, and understanding how rapid change in activities will transform into change in labor markets, I think will be very important as well. So these are very different versions, as it were, of where data will be important. In the systems, in understanding what you're buying, and in the various markets that will be important here. I've already spoken about the importance of data in financial markets. That I think is there's a task force which is called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, which arose from Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg when Mark was head of the Bank for International Settlements. He asked Mike Bloomberg to lead a task force on climate-related financial disclosure. So disclosing in finance the risks that are embodied in the assets that you own. So that's another area where data and transparency will be very important. And we all know that economists have got better and better with data over this last couple of decades. So those are, I think that's 4 areas. There must be many more. 4 areas where data will be of fundamental importance. But it's the problem with data is it's backwards and looking backwards. And this is a problem of looking forwards. Of course, we have to learn from the data we've got. We must. But this is one where the forward look and the using the data that we have to forward look is of enormous importance. And it's not just forecasting in a macro model a few quarters down the track. This is much deeper and more difficult than that. So I think whilst I've tried to describe areas where data will be important, There's a different aspect of this, is to use the data so that we can anticipate as best we possibly can over 5, 10, 15 years and more. And that is something which I think is enormously important, and something which we haven't been very good at because it's such a hard problem. But we can't avoid it because it's hard, because it's central. So we have to take on how to use data to look forward with all the uncertainties and risks and so on involved in doing that. That I think is particularly tough. And I wrote this paper in honor of Tony Public Economics, As If Time Matters. And that side of it, of anticipating, including what we don't know, will be very important. And that's going to be hard.
Lots of challenges. So now there's a very specific UK question, which has attracted lots of interest, which is, why isn't the UK net zero set on a consumption basis rather than on an unfair territorial basis? And secondly, why aren't carbon taxes paramount as they were in the 2006 review?
The answer to the first question is we should look at both. We should absolutely look at both. I mean, countries benefit from what they produce, and consumers benefit from what they consume. And I'm in total agreement that we need both. I wouldn't say replace one by the other, but we have to run, because they both carry information. I can't remember how many times I said in the lecture that carbon pricing is extremely important and should be at center stage. That's absolutely crucial. But it's very odd to say that because you think other things are important too, that somehow you're removing carbon pricing from center stage. Absolutely not. I went out of my way to say it's at center stage. But to say it's the only thing at center stage is a very, very serious mistake. I gave 6 clear market failures, and I did put the externality number 1. Those aren't slight extra sort of footnotes. Those are big extra market failures. Those 5 further market failures, from capital markets through to and R&D through to the co-benefits and air pollution. You can't just tackle those with the carbon price. You can't do the massive system changes just with the carbon price. Are carbon prices of central importance? Yes, and I'll say it again, carbon prices are of central importance, but they're not the only thing. They're saying you can't do it just by carbon prices, but don't lose them.
Thank you, and I think that came over very clearly. So, and now a wider question is, how should governments and policymakers deal with countries and administrations that deny the existence of climate change or are reluctant to take adequate action on that? And I could add to that, thinking about maybe somewhere like Australia that's suffered a lot from climate change, but has a big lobby that does not want to really address that. But it's everywhere in many countries. So how do you think governments and policymakers should deal with that reluctance?
I think setting strong examples yourself is very important, and showing the returns to acting strongly on this. It's no longer simply a free riding problem, because the kinds of changes we have to make really are very attractive. I think that in some cases, border adjustments are going to be important. They're not important in many things, but they are important in things like steel. And there it seems to me that you could act. You don't need a massive structure there, because there are only 4 or 5 industries that really matter. Steel, I would put number 1. So there are places where you can act. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than that very narrow view, because it's changing everywhere, and acting together, sharing technologies, encouraging the young to do what the young are doing on this. I think that's all part of the story.
Well, we have unfortunately run out of time. That's a very positive note to end on. And I'd just like to, there are lots of more questioners sitting in the room that would like to ask questions. So I'd just like to thank you, Nick, for a fascinating, overarching, and yet detailed talk. And you just illustrate so well what we have to do, how we have to think. So thank you so much from all of us and we look forward to reading and hearing more from you. So goodbye from Nick, goodbye from me, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Carol.